Right, let's get started. My talk's called Revisiting the Jungle of Glass Rectangles. It's called Revisiting the topic because I've spoken about this a few times before. First time I spoke about these glass rectangles, which is my term for all these iOS devices that we have invading our lives, was last year at the Cocoa Heads meetup here at Krakow, where I was asked at the last minute to do a talk, and I decided to have an off-the-cuff talk about all these devices and all these device sizes that we find ourselves developing for nowadays, and how different that is to how the platform started out not that long ago. So that's what the glass rectangles is coming from, and the revisiting. But who am I? My name's Tom. I'm an iOS developer. I've been building products, leading teams in some shape or form for the last 20 years. Not on iOS. I've done a lot of enterprise development. I've worked for large companies like Cisco and Oracle and Sun Microsystems, very big organizations, and I've worked for quite a few startups as well, both in the .com days in the 90s, as well as the last couple of years with the whole mobile revolution. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm originally from Belgium, but I've been living in Stockholm for the last 3 years, which I'm enjoying a lot. And this is a picture of me standing in front of a beautiful, amazing lake in Ireland. And as you can see, what am I doing? I'm looking at my screen. I'm sure you have some pictures taken of you that are similar. Right now, I'm working for a tiny little startup that I founded with some friends, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a new way to connect people with locals in specific cities to get advice on restaurants, on where to find a hard-to-find item, to kind of tap into that local information that's so hard to find using regular algorithmic web searches or kind of public information that you find in the likes of TripAdvisor or Quora or things like that. So that's what I'm focused on now, and we'll be launching in 2 weeks' time, which explains the dark circles you see under my eyes. And if you're interested to hear more about this, or if you want to test, we're launching in 2 cities, in Brussels and Amsterdam initially. Come talk to me afterwards, and I can set you up with an account. So the agenda for today, this is not a technical talk for 2 reasons. First of all, I don't learn that easily from a technical talk with code. When somebody explains code to me, usually I need to kind of play around with it myself and try things out before it actually sticks. The other reason is that there's people way smarter than me that can tell you about code, and there's going to be a number of those talks in this conference. So I'm sorry to disappoint you if you're a hardcore developer and you're looking for some functional Swift. I'm afraid I'm too dumb for that. So there you go. What will we be talking about? Well, I want to invite you all at the start of this conference, at the first day, to kind of take a step back. I know your coworker has just caused a merged conflict on the project file, and I know that the core data stack is blowing up in production because of a schema migration, but like, close it all down and let's take a step back and think about how we got here and what's happened in this pretty brief period of time. Because we take today's devices for granted. We're very much focused on new things, on like the latest and greatest. But I find it useful to force myself from time to time to take a step back and look at the evolution of the platform and try to maybe find some patterns and see how they can help us in how we approach development today, and to how we make our products in a way that they stand the test of time. So that's the first thing I want to do, like see how we ended up here. Second thing is, what kind of problems does the current landscape present to us? I already talked about all these different glass rectangles. That's causing some problems for us as developers, I think, or as makers of products. And then thirdly, I want to talk about some tactics, some tricks, some solutions that might help dealing with this complexity. So part one. For that, I'd like you to take a step back and go all the way back to January 2007, the famous Steve Jobs keynote. Who hasn't seen the Steve Jobs keynote for the first iPhone? Well, you haven't? Well, it's worth a watch. And I think for many of us, this is where kind of the journey starts. This is a new platform that got a lot of people excited, and kind of the central realization that this device implemented was that we could get rid of a lot of the buttons that we used to on a phone and just concentrate on having this big piece of glass that we can project any user interface onto. So that it can be a calculator with a certain button configuration, or it can be a phone or a widescreen iPod, which was one of the products cited in the original keynote. How many people still think about their iPhone as a widescreen iPod? I wonder. It's probably hasn't stood the test of time. But the central realization there is that we'll make this trade-off. We'll get rid of the buttons and we'll just have this canvas, this piece of glass that we can project any user interface onto. And it is a trade-off because I don't know about you, but I was kind of used to using the buttons in a blind way sometimes. You know, some people were really good at the texting with the number keypads. They could do it blind. They could do it while they were driving a car. All that went out of the window with this trade-off. But what it gave us back was an incredibly flexible device that could run a number of different experiences. So here we are, first iPhone. We have one screen, 320 by 480 pixels. 3.5-inch screen. And that's our canvas. That's as soon as we're allowed to develop apps for it, there's a wealth of products that starts coming out. And everybody's developing for this fixed canvas. And a lot of the code out there is doing things like pixel calculations and overriding the draw rect in your UI view, because not only is the screen a given, it's fixed. Everybody has the same type of screen, but also the hardware is still fairly low powered, so you have to optimize things. And in a lot of cases, you're rewriting draw rect method so that your table view will scroll smoothly enough, and that you get that 60 frames a second buttery smooth animation that you're looking for. So that's 2007. 2008, we get the iPhone 3G. No change on the screen. I mean, the primary change is that we now have an app store and that we have faster cellular networking. But the screen, the canvas that we work on as developers is still the same. 2009, 3GS. Again, same canvas. Actually, there was one change to the screen. If you've seen this an earlier iteration of the presentation, you might know it. What was the big innovation on the screen for the 3GS? Anybody? There's no prizes, I'm sorry. It's an oleophobic screen. I love that word. I mean, who used this word in daily parlance before 2009? So we have a screen that's supposedly more fingerprint proof. I look at my screen today; it's still a greasy mess. But and then 2010, where we get the first really big innovation in the screen technology, and we're suddenly having to deal with a Retina screen that's twice the amount of pixels in each dimension, and we're having to add a new type of assets to our bundle, the A2X assets. And for the first time, things get a little bit complicated. I mean, there's no longer a direct mapping between a pixel on the screen and a pixel in our code. So we get the abstraction of points that we use, but by and large, it's still fairly manageable. 2011, we get the iPhone 4S. And then 2012, we get another new screen size. We get a taller phone with the iPhone 5, 176 extra pixels in the vertical dimension, which for a lot of apps basically translates for roughly to an extra table row. And it's again something we deal with. We add the launch image to support the new device to unlock the support, and we support the new screen. 2013, iPhone 5S, no change to the screen. What was the big innovation? Touch ID was one. Excuse me? sRGB. Oh, you mean the color space? Yeah, yep. That's a good point. Totally forgot about that. No, it's of course that there's a gold phone now. I mean, this was all people were talking about. People were not talking about sRGB. It's like, I'm going to get the gold phone. And then 2014, and this to me is really the tipping point where if you haven't realized by now that the time of developing for fixed screen sizes is well and truly over, then you should have realized in the fall of 2014 when we get not one new screen size but we get two. We get one phone that's too large and one that's comically large. So we have two new screens that we need to deal with in our code. And for the large one, it's even more complicated because we get new assets, the A3X assets that we need to ship in our bundle. And the actual end result that people see on the screen is hardware scaled to a different resolution than what the A3X assets would natively be displayed at. So it gets a lot more complicated in one product release cycle. And that brings us to 2015. And when I last spoke about this in 2014, my sort of armchair prediction was that it's becoming a lot more complicated. Apple is no longer the company making just one device that should be good enough for everybody. Apple is kind of filling out the holes in their product lineup. Everybody is moving to smartphones. The whole world is. And because of that, there are different use cases emerging. There are people in some markets where their phone is their primary device. There are people where their phone is the device they use all the time to watch video. And in that case, why wouldn't you want what I like to call a comically large phone? I mean, for some use cases, that's the perfect fit. So my kind of armchair prediction was that things are gonna get more complicated for a while, and we won't get back to the simplicity of old. So rewind 3 weeks, we saw Apple's latest product introduction, and these are the devices they showed, like Phil Schiller showed on stage. This is just the devices that they were talking about. So we've got 3 sizes of iPhone that they're actively selling, and we've got 3 sizes of iPads, because we now have the iPad Pro as well. More headaches for developers. So Apple is slowly filling up these holes in their product line, and they expect us to develop products that ideally, if you look at all the kind of policy moves that Apple is making, ideally they would like us to ship one bundle that works across as many of these devices as possible. And I'm not even talking about things like the TV or the watch now, which in the case of the watch, those resources end up in that same bundle as well. So what kind of problems is this causing? You can prove anything with the graph, so I figured I'd make one. Looking at different screen types, and I'm looking purely at physical size of the screen and pixel density. This is the sort of evolution that we've seen since the introduction of the original iPhone. So I didn't speak much about the iPad before, but the iPad has very much gone through a similar progression as the iPhone. So we started out for 2 years, we had one type of iPad screen, the one physical size, one type of assets, and then we got in 1 year we got a Retina version of the 9.7. It's 9.7 inch screen, and we got a new smaller form factor in the iPad Mini, which then went Retina as well, and now just recently in 2015 we got the iPad Pro, which is another device size we're developing for. So that's a lot of complexity to deal with, and it brings along a lot of challenges. One of them, for instance, is how are you going to test across this many devices? Do you have all these devices physically? Do you have a test lab? There's a lot of problems, but the ones I'm trying to focus on here is how do we manage the resources? So everything that's not code that we put in the bundle, for the types of applications that I build, this is primarily images. How do we manage that process of making sure that the right images end up in the bundle? And secondly, how do we manage the size of that bundle that gets shipped to people's devices? I'm sure many of you have followed the kind of controversy surrounding the smallest size Apple devices that get sold. The iPhone with 16 gigabytes, for instance. It's in many cases, for many people, those devices are permanently full. So the size of our bundle matters a lot if we want to stay on the device and not get deleted because it's a choice between another app or a video of a grandchild. So. And then thirdly, as the complexity of this rises, I think one of our main focuses should be how can we improve the collaboration with our designers. We're developing for a lot of form factors, and that feedback loop with designers in a lot of environments is purely one where we request some assets and like the designer throws it over the wall, we put it in the bundle, and that's it. And that simply no longer works for most apps. We need a tighter feedback loop where designers can see the result of their work more quickly on the in the actual app, and where there's an easier way of communicating around those designs. So what are some solutions? I should preface this with a huge big disclaimer first. I'm kind of wary of any time somebody gets up on a stage or gets in front of a group of people and says like, I have a solution. Because everything I'm going to tell you is based on my background and my experience, which is very specific. So the project I'm working on right now is a fairly small app. It's not a huge, ambitious undertaking. We're a small team. There's 4 of us working across the product, and that's back-end design development. We're not even all full-time. And we are in 4 different cities. So that's my background. Those are my that's my set of parameters that I have to work with, which means that I have to come up with different solutions than, say, a software engineer at Facebook or at Spotify, which are much larger organizations. And whenever I see a presentation about those environments, I see a lot of amazing ideas, but I also see a lot of ideas that I simply cannot implement because we need to do very much with very little in the environment that we are in. And then the other kind of caveat I should give you is that my background is primarily in UI kit, like productivity software, enterprise software, fairly run-of-the-mill standard productivity applications. I have no experience whatsoever with games, and that's a whole different world unto itself. And to give you an illustration of how much I know about games, this is a fun game. Who's played Crossy Road? Who hasn't played Crossy Road? But to my mind, this one was still kind of more fun. So that gives you an idea why I should never be allowed to talk about games again. So the first tactic we can use when dealing with this huge variety of devices is simply like, can we avoid having to support some of these devices? And that might seem like a ridiculously trivial and simple solution, but I think it's actually one that should be a part of your product strategy. Are you going to support the iPad? Because there's a big cost that comes with that. Can you deliver a user interface that makes your app shine on the iPad? Does the iPad make sense for this this specific problem that you're trying to solve? So first of all, I would look at this variety of screens and see, is there some stuff we can avoid? And the story there is fairly tricky because Apple doesn't give us a lot of controls to influence this. We can say we make an application for iPhone or iPad, and we can say which iOS version we support and some additional capabilities. But by and large, if you have the luxury of supporting iOS 8 or iOS 9 only, that still means today that you need to go back all the way to the iPhone 4S, released in 2011. So you don't really have very fine-grained controls there, but at least on the distinction between like the support of an iPad or an iPhone, I would definitely consider this in a very deliberate way, just like you should consider every feature in your app. Is this something that needs to be built? Does it need to be part of the product right now? And you're in good company if you do. I mean, these guys, by all accounts, pretty successful product. They still don't have an iPad app. It hasn't really hindered them. Or if you look at Paper, another very popular, iconic application, they started out in 2012 with an iPad-only app, and they've only recently released an iPhone app. And the reasoning they give about this is that they didn't know how to deliver a good experience on the iPhone at first. They wanted to concentrate on getting the product right on the iPad and then tackle the other platform later, which is exactly what they did. Then my next piece of advice is to follow Apple's lead and watch what Apple is doing. This again a fairly obvious piece of advice, yet I see it being ignored all the time by people. So Apple has a way of very carefully and deliberately planning out how their platform evolves over multiple years. And while occasionally they will backtrack on something, there have been cases of that. In general, once you take a step back and look at what they've been doing for a couple of years, it's remarkable the patterns that arise. So in this specific realm, talking about dealing with different screen sizes, in 2012 we got auto layout, which was a new system of specifying our UI without having to deal with explicit coordinates, but by specifying rules that were put through a solver that would come up with the best mapping to screen coordinates based on those rules. 2013 we got a huge design makeover that was much more toned down, less reliant on skeuomorphism and textures. I mean, let's say we wouldn't have had the iOS 7 redesign. Can you imagine a skeuomorphic interface on the iPad Pro? Like a huge wood paneling on a screen this big? I can't see it. And at the time, this was a very controversial move, but I think what happened in later years has shown how necessary this move to a different design language actually was. Second change, or second addition Apple made in 2013 was asset catalogs, where for the first time we had a mechanism to manage the resources that we put in our bundle and attach them to some metadata and categorize them based on the device that they were meant to be used on. 2014, size classes. Again, if you look at the multitasking features now, if you look at the way the iPad Pro lets you use 2 apps simultaneously, that would never have been even remotely feasible without the addition of size classes. But the size classes arrived more than a year before the iPad Pro actually arrived. Another minor addition Apple made there was the PDF assets that I'll talk about later. Which brings us to this year's platform additions. So last summer, WWDC. It's actually kind of funny because the first time I had this conversation with some of you in the Cocoa Heads meetup last year in Krakow here was, I remember one remark, I forget who it was, I think it was Blajay, where he was saying, we were talking about the fact that Apple still ships a big bundle that has all the resources for every device that you support, and everybody gets that same bundle regardless of the device that they have in their hands. And how nice it would be if Apple were to generate different bundles that are optimized per device. And of course, this year at WWDC, that's exactly what Apple announced. So they announced something they call app thinning, which has different components. First, app slicing, where the different bundles are generated for the different permutations of device types that exist. And when you download an app from the App Store, you only get the version that has the code parts that are for your processor, and that only has the resources, whether they're images or sounds or maybe even data files that are different per device. And you get a bundle that's tailor-made for you or for your type of device. Second addition that Apple made in the app thinning was on-demand resources. So there's a new class you can use, and there's support in Xcode to make asset packs where you can actually tag resources and decide in your code when they get downloaded and when they get disposed of. And then thirdly, there's bitcode, which is an intermediary format that I won't be talking much about, but which again promises to make for smaller bundle sizes, but then on the code front, not on the resources. So let's have a look at some of these changes. I don't know how readable this is. Looks fairly okay, I think. So if you look at an asset catalog in Xcode 7, there's a couple of new things. For instance, this section here, where you can now make different assets based on the version of Metal that your device supports, as well as the amount of internal memory. And I don't know if you saw, I think it was a week or two ago, there was a funny news item where a developer discovered early how much internal memory the new iPhones had before having access to the hardware. And he was actually using this functionality, just putting two images in there, one for the 1 GB and one for the 2 GB memory, and then running it in the two simulators, like for the old iPhone 6 and for the iPhone 6s. And that way he was able to confirm how much memory the new devices had. So I thought that was a neat trick. Another thing, let's see, where am I here? Okay, yeah, well, another thing that's not entirely new that Apple added in Xcode 6 was a PDF workflow. So there's really limited support for vectors. I don't know how many of you use this. Okay, yeah, it's more than I thought. So this is really the only way Apple allows you to have vector images that you put in your bundle without having to generate all the different size assets yourself. And it's right over here. You can select vector there and then put in one vector image in the form of a PDF, which is kind of limited. And then during the build, Apple will take that PDF and scale it to the at 1x, at 2x, and at 3x versions. Now, the there's quite a few problems with this, as I'm sure some of you experienced, in the sense that your PDF needs to be constructed in a certain way for it to work well, and then it will only work for certain types of images, which typically are line drawings that are fairly simple. And there's actually a really good blog post by Mark Edwards at Django, where he shows and he explains how this kind of workflow breaks down for some images. As soon as you're doing things like anti-aliasing or using gradients, then the results are less than ideal, shall we say. But for some cases, for the typical images that maybe you'll use in a UI toolbar, for instance, this can work quite well, and it can save you a little bit of time. For the project that I'm working on, the designer is already used to coming up with different assets, and he's got his pipeline for that, so it doesn't really save us any time. Plus, it takes some control away from him. So we'd rather he verify that the images are optimal at the different resolutions. And then if we look at the organizer in Xcode, we see how that asset catalog that we used earlier, how that ends up being used for app thinning, where we can now generate a bundle that's specific for each device. So it's important to know, if you haven't adopted asset catalogs yet, these the slicing functionality will only work for resources that are inside an asset catalog. And one of the things Apple did to accommodate that is they also added support for arbitrary types as long as they're not executable code. So an asset catalog is no longer just for images or for graphics assets. If you have like data for a 3D model, that should be different for different devices. For instance, you can put that in there as well. Or if you have a plist with data or whatever, that can all be in the asset catalog, and only the correct resource will be delivered to the user. So if you do this, I did it just before this presentation with an early build of our app, and the result here is that where is it again? Okay, this is the only bundle that we would have generated before, the 6.3 megabyte one. There's very few resources in there right now, I should add, otherwise it would be a lot bigger. And then if you look at the individual versions that we only support iPhone, actually. I don't know what these are doing here, but they are about half that size. This is, of course, you should test this on your project. This is just anecdotally, it can give quite a big space savings. This is really new. It will only work with devices that have iOS 9 installed. So any device that's not on iOS 9, if you support anything below that, they will still get the universal build like they did before. And the fact that it's really new also bears out in news like this. So a couple of days ago, it turned out that there was a problem with iCloud backups causing the feature to break. And I don't know what the current status is. I know there's been a new version of Xcode that fixes things on Xcode's end, but I don't know if it works on people's devices yet. So if anybody has tried it recently, let me know. So what else can we do? We've looked at Apple's tools and the solutions they hand us to deal with this jungle of screens, and help us manage resources and bundle size. There's a couple of other tactics that I've used with varying success, and I'd love to hear your feedback about this, or if you've used any other solutions, please come to me. First one is, instead of using graphics assets, to actually render the assets on the fly in code, or and there's probably the best known tool for this is Paint Code, which allows you to take, for instance, an SVG image, and it will spit out code that you can include in your project. And I've only used this in a limited fashion with some of the assets that are least likely to change, because there's a lot to like about this solution. It's very flexible, because this, for the first time, gives you the real runtime capability to scale your image to any size you want. Whereas Apple's PDF workflow will just, like, at build time, generate the assets for you. But if you try to resize them later in your app, you'll still get a stretched bitmap. By using code, you don't have this limitation. The thing I don't like about it is that it's an extra step, an extra kind of step of processing that will sit between you and your designer. So if you're trying to tighten that feedback loop with your designer, if you're trying to have an efficient pipeline, then either you'll need to automate this or thread with care. Second technique I've used is one, I think, that originally comes from web development, where a bunch of the image assets are bundled inside a font file, which is also a vector format. And then instead of loading individual images, or instead of rendering the image using code in your code base, you use a font, which is again cool in that it gives you real vector capability. You can actually scale the image without any lossiness. The thing I don't like about it is that it's kind of a hack on a UI kit level, because using a font now means that, well, you need a mapping between what characters in the font, which Unicode characters map to which symbols. So you're maintaining that as a separate thing to maintain in your code base. And then on top of that, you're no longer dealing with, say, UI image view to show an image. No, you're now rendering it as a UI label, which is kind of weird. There's probably smarter ways of solving this, but I haven't used them. And then lastly, automation. Something that's interesting to mention here is in a lot of environments, your designers already have existing tools that they like, that they've been using for years, that they have the shortcuts ingrained in their muscle memory. So I think there's very little use trying to change that or touch that, because you're just going to destroy their productivity. What you can do is come up with ways of integrating the results of their work more easily into your code base. And one of the things Apple has done there is they've now documented the Xcode asset format, and you can actually build scripts or build a pipeline, use tools that will directly take the assets coming from a developer's Photoshop or Sketch or whatever, and put them straight into the asset catalog. Lastly, collaboration. So I keep talking about tightening the feedback loop with your designers, and one part of that, of course, is what Kevin was mentioning this morning, is to release as often as possible and make sure that designers can see the result of their work on their device as frequently as possible in quick iterations. So we do that. We use TestFlight and Hockey App for that. But apart from that, there's a lot of communication around the designs and the kind of design changes that get made as well. And again, this is very specific to the way that I work, because we're 4 people in 4 different cities. If you're in an office with 100 people, you're probably going to converge on a completely different set of tools. But this is just for what it's worth. First of all, I live in Slack. This is our office. And this is where a lot of the communication and the decision, the feature triage, deciding what platforms we're going to support, are we going to make a WatchKit extension or not. A lot of this communication happens in Slack. We have one weekly call, but apart from that, everything else happens in Slack. And then, well, sometimes we will break out and we will call each other, but we try to have as few meetings as possible. because we all work fairly different hours as well. So Slack helps tremendously with that. There's other tools like HipChat, or I mean, people have their preferences. I like Slack a lot. Second tool, and this space is getting really crowded. So if you have any advice, by all means tell me, because I've noticed that there in the last year or so there's been a lot of new tools coming out, and trying to help this communication. Like, how can we work with prototypes? How can we communicate around the design? There's a lot of activity in this space. So we've used two of those more recent products. One of them is InVision, which we use for our prototypes. So our designer makes a prototype that's posted online that we can like see in a web browser and play around with, and then we can comment on it. So a lot of times what will happen is, like, while I'm developing a view, for instance, I'll have a question about a certain aspect of the design, or I'll want to know how a certain animation needs to work, and I'll post it through InVision. And so we can actually see the screen that we're talking about, and we can point to items, and that's something that has helped in that part of the collaboration. And then lastly, we use a tool called Zeppelin, which is still a very young tool. It's a little buggy at times, but we've used that. There's some overlap with InVision, but what we use Zeppelin for primarily is for the more detailed kind of style guide type specs for each screen. So Zeppelin allows me to inspect the screen and see what font is being used, what size the elements are, and really drill down. It allows me to export the colors used in the design, export the assets. Actually, we do that with both. But so that's some of the tools that have been helpful for us. There's still a lot of room for improvement in this space, I think, and it's one of the more exciting areas to watch, I think. I don't know, I keep having the impression that Apple is sort of moving in a direction where designers would be designing in Xcode. I don't know. I don't know if that's feasible. I'm in Interface Builder. Because that's something we still struggle with a lot, is that ultimately all these designs that we communicate about will have to be translated into auto layout rules. And as it stands today, I don't think auto layout is a tool that's very accessible or useful for somebody with a design background. But maybe I'm wrong. So if you have different experiences, let me know. I've found this part still a struggle, and this is often where we need to communicate the most, like talk about, okay, how does this layout change if we go to a bigger device, and then I can try to come up with the corresponding auto layout strategy, but it's tricky. That's all I have for you. Thank you. And there's some resources there. You can upload. So that's the blog post I was talking about some of the caveats with the PDF workflow. And then the rest are links to Apple's documentation and WWDC sessions. So.
Okay, so if you have any question, don't be afraid to ask. Just, okay.
Hi, thank you for a nice talk. Those things, what you were talking about, are really cool, but from my experience and my perspective and performance experience, are unuseful. I'll tell you why. I tell you why.
Okay.
Firstly, auto layout. When you are using auto layout, you have to use XIMP files, or you have to use storyboard. With big projects, storyboards, it's actually XML file, so it's the time of compiling the project is really long, and it's really boring. So this is really unuseful, because the development time is really expensive. So much better is just write your layout in source code. I know nobody likes maths, but performance is much better. Second, assets catalog. when you want to get any image from asset catalog, you have to use UI kit library, which isn't thread safe. So you cannot call any loader from background thread. So as well, asset catalogs is unuseful because you lost your performance. And the third part about slicing as well, it's really powerful feature, but actually, as you told, it's not working. I don't know, I was testing it on a Xcode 7.1 beta, and it wasn't work. I don't know if Apple has been released a new version, but slicing still it's not working. Apple agreed, developers of Apple agreed on an official forum that this part is actually not working.
Yeah, the way I understand it is like they fixed some of the problems in 7.0.1 of Xcode, but that will, I think they need an iOS 9 update as well, right? Because it was on the devices that something was going wrong.
Yeah, the problem was with exporting API file.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it was, and Xcode was throwing many exceptions, which aren't supported by any documentation. So there was a lot of posts on Stack Overflow that this feature is just not working.
Yeah, I mean, it's all fair points. I mean, when I say you should keep an eye on Apple and see what kind of direction they set out, we're used to this. There's always these growing pains. I first tried to move to auto layout when they just introduced it using Interface Builder. I spent a whole summer tearing out my hairs and vowed never to use Interface Builder again. So right now I'm writing my auto layout rules in code, which is definitely not the way Apple intends us to, because everything they do seems to point towards use storyboards for your apps. And I think we'll get there, but I got burned by trying to adopt it too soon for my needs, and for my needs it wasn't the right fit. I know other people that are super happy with it. So again, your points about performance, I write fairly run-of-the-mill UI kit applications where I don't run into enormous performance constraints. So I haven't really hit those. But yeah, it depends what you're doing. And certainly, I think experiment with the new features that Apple adds and then wait until they're stable.
Yeah.
I think something like app slicing is such a big payoff if and when it works in the wild, that it's going to be worth adopting. But I don't know when we get there. Soon, I hope. But it's still very early. I mean,
yes, of course.
we've only just installed iOS 9 and done 600 app updates. So
yeah, the idea of the out loud is amazing, but
yeah,
the work is not so
slow progress.
Yeah, it's just a slow progress.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you very much.
Anyone? Okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. And come to me if you want to talk about this stuff. Thanks.